Welcome back, everybody. It is with great pleasure that I get to introduce today's next speaker. He will be giving a talk on avoiding senseless security metrics. Keon Williams is the Managing Director at CLASS-LLC. Welcome, Keon.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. Hopefully I've done this properly and you can see my slides. So as the story goes, I have been a friend and once upon a time a family member of EC-Council, and I love the Global CISO Forum so much that I volunteered to be on the advisory board and help put topics and information together. Obviously with that, there comes a huge amount of pressure for my presentation to at least be adequate, if not awesome, when I'm presenting. And so I put a lot of thought into what we're going to talk about today. For the last couple of years, metrics have been my soapbox topic along with people. And those are the two areas that I spend a lot of time. The reason that I called this senseless security metrics and the reason that we're trying to avoid this is because there is a huge challenge for cybersecurity people globally to think about metrics, to frame them in the right context, and most importantly, to communicate them to their business counterparts. When we're communicating metrics to our business counterparts, what people often overlook, especially if they have a deep technical background, is that the people who are receiving the information that you're sending often don't speak the same language that you're speaking. As we go forward, there'll be a moment where we talk about the language of cybersecurity and all of the things that are awesome in the way that we talk, in the way that we communicate, and everything else that we do. But very often our counterparts, our chief financial officer, our chief executive officer, and even to an extent, our chief information officers, and all the board members and executives who receive our information and have to make decisions have not spent the same amount of time honing their ability to use cybersecurity language to drive their initiatives, their activities, and their work. And so a component of this conversation is really just focused on the transformation engine, or the Rosetta Stone that's going to take everything that we're talking about and put it into a format that people who receive the information can understand and can make sure that they can use. Now, as we go forward, I have some information about my background and my biography. The objective of the background is not to say that I am the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's really meant to highlight that I am a credible witness for this story and that there is a little bit of wisdom that comes from all of the time that I've spent being old and gray around the edges and having spent 20 years in the industry. You know, professionally, I've done everything from running the billion-dollar PEPFAR program. And when I say running, we're really talking about building the security strategy for everything that's associated with it, making sure that we have controls in place, making sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. But the context of the program and the fact that it was a billion-dollar program highlights how important it is to pay attention, to communicate the right information, and make sure that information is distributed properly across all the organizations. After my 12 years at the Centers for Disease Control, I had a blast hanging out with EC-Council. I appreciate that Jay Bavisi gave me the opportunity to do amazing things like travel to Malaysia and teach Cybersecurity Malaysia's team that supports strategy for the country. It's like, how often do people get to do things like that? And because of that, and because of this long relationship, there's really cool perspective that comes from doing all of the things that I've been blessed to do in all of the places that I have been blessed to do it. You see in my biography that I listed that I'm a college professor, and that's one of the things that I really enjoy. But as a college professor, it's very important to attribute to other people the facts, the wisdom, and the data that you use in your own work. And so if I can pause for a moment before we really get into my story and everything that I want to tell you, it's important to me personally to highlight a great conversation that I had with Marcus Random back in 2015 when he was floating around with IONS and providing information, providing talks, and sharing with the world great perspective about metrics. It's really from these conversations and the combination of my work at the CDC, because they do statistical analysis about public health information, that I started to think very critically about the way that we're measuring things in cybersecurity and the way that we're communicating our measurements to our audience. According to Marcus, as you see on the slide, by simple definition, a metric is just some data and an algorithm for reducing it to tell a story. The trick to the process is, what is the data that we need? what is the algorithm that we're going to use, and what is the story that we want people to receive from our communication. In a security context, or from a security perspective, one of the most important items is the context of the story that we're telling. It's specific information about relevant processes, and most of the processes that we use in security are coming from somewhere that it's hard to measure data, it's hard to make decisions, it's hard to drive action. The conversation that Marcus and I had back in 2015 and that continued over a couple of years was so awesome that I reached out to him and to Alex Hutton, who was the co-author of the presentation at the time, and got their permission to incorporate that data into the certified CISO body of knowledge when Jay gave me an opportunity to update the document. And since then, I've continued to shape and reshape and tinker and explore in every way possible what is the best way to capture information that describes security, and what is the best format to demonstrate and communicate that information in a way that resonates with boards of directors, with senior leadership, and with the people who have the power to drive action that supports the goals of the security program and ultimately supports everything that the CISO is doing to add value to the organization and make sure that we're doing the right things. Now, if we take this from an academic perspective, again, I said I'm a teacher, so I can't help myself. We want to list things out in terms of bullets. And so if we focus specifically on the problem that we're solving, the great problem or the great challenge for a lot of CISOs, for a lot of senior security leaders, and even when you start getting into enterprise risk management, a lot of boards and risk management professionals struggle to develop precise security metrics or precise metrics of any format. In all of the data that we're gathering, it's very difficult to tell a clear story and to paint a very good picture. And the combination of developing the right metrics, making sure that they're precise, and then communicating the value of those metrics so that we can use them to tell a story, to drive an action, or to cause some type of significant investment in organizational dollars, or if we're doing opportunity cost and we're evaluating, do I do this security thing or do I do this business operations thing? Metrics is going to be a very valuable tool to help you tell the right story. Now, as I said in my opening monologue, one of the challenges that we face is definitions and how people communicate and how we talk about things. You know, I have a CIS bachelor's degree. I have a master's degree in business with a concentration in security. I am a unique person who has spent 20 years, and if you combine my time in the Army, even more than 20 years, thinking about risk, how do you manage risk, and what are all the terms that describe everything that we're doing. The problem that a lot of people have is that definitions or words by themselves, independent of the definition and the context, mean different things to different audiences. You know, when we talk about forensics, the idea of authentication and forensics means something completely different in cybersecurity. And so even though you have two people working in the same field, if you have different specializations and different backgrounds, you are going to understand terms differently and have different perspectives and draw different conclusions. And so when we talk about confidentiality and impact and privacy and vulnerabilities and threats and all the words that we use in our day-to-day security conversations, there's often a situation where the person receiving the information, if they don't have the same background, if they don't have the same training, if they haven't spent the same amount of time doing what we're doing as security professionals, they are going to jump to different conclusions if we don't explain things. And so security words in a security context ultimately are going to have a different meaning than security words in a business context. It drives us as security leaders to have to think about who are we talking to. To think about who we're talking to, we have to have a relationship with those people. And then based on my relationship and what I understand about the recipient of my information, I can frame things in the right context. If I'm talking to a financial executive, there's all kinds of documentation related to financial risk management. And so we can have a risk conversation, we can have a cybersecurity conversation, but it becomes my burden to transform important things into a context and into a format that the chief financial officer understands. The same thing applies with your operating officer. I spend a lot of time working in industrial control systems where safety is a big concern. And so the same story is going to be repeated over and over again, where the CISO is going to take all of that data, all of that information, and all of those findings and assumptions and package them in a way that resonates with the recipients of the information rather than forcing the people who have not spent 20 years doing what you're doing to understand what you're talking about in your context. Now, the biggest misconception that happens in definitions is the definition of cybersecurity. The official definition of cybersecurity actually started in Homeland Security Presidential Directive 54, where the Department of Defense had a classified document and talked about cyberspace and cybersecurity and how everything works. And since then, as we have moved forward, as people have taken the word cyber and cyberspace and cybersecurity and cyber asset and used them in marketing contexts, and you see it in Hollywood where random people use a cell phone to hack into satellites and they're not even communicating on the same frequency, there's a lot of misconception and there's a lot of assumption about what different terms and definitions mean. I went to Wikipedia to find the definition for cybersecurity to support our conversation because that is a general, broadly accepted definition. You know, the problem with our communication with the business starts with things like this definition, where it is highly technical and leads people to think about cybersecurity incorrectly. When I'm working as a security executive, I'm in the role of the CISO or the chief risk officer, or even the chief information officer who has enterprise-wide responsibilities for security and for the controls that achieve our security goals. The common definition of security is focusing on cybersecurity in a technical perspective without thinking about the business context within which cybersecurity exists. Our challenge then is to transform that technical jargon and that technical context where we're talking about network security and encryption and all of your technical controls that are in ISO or that are in NIST or in the CIS critical security controls. Most of those frameworks are speaking in a language that does not resonate with business people. And so business context is our key term, and as our driving principle is what we're really looking forward to, so that we can take all of that information, repackage it, run it through the Rosetta Stone, and then spit out relevant, actionable business information based on the data that we've gathered, the things that we're seeing. Often I'm going to need to combine people, processes, and technology into the conversation so that I can speak in business terms about whether or not we have enough people to satisfy our requirements. Are the processes that are in place the right processes to achieve our risk management and cybersecurity goals? It's not just about the technology, but it's about the entire combination of all of those items. Now, when I go to the board or when I go to senior leadership or I go to our executives, we can focus on what is the context of risk that the organization is facing, and how are we using people, process, and technology to respond to that risk? Are we trying to avoid it? Are we trying to accept it? Are we trying to transfer it using insurance or partnerships? Or are we willing to take the steps that are necessary and invest what is required to transform the risk and reduce it to an acceptable level? Regardless of the approach, it's still going to be a combination of people, processes, and technology. And once we apply all of those things to the environment, there really is a requirement that we measure it and that we communicate to the business. Dear business, you have given me all these resources. This is what I'm doing with what you've given me. Now, when we talk about measurements, again, measurement is a bit of a fuzzy term depending on who you're talking to. In the physical world, according to Bill Nye, I went all the way into the Wayback Machine, and I'm taking you back to 1998. And so according to Bill Nye, and rewatching this episode, it's a lot of fun and it adds a lot of interesting perspective just to the idea of measurement. According to Bill Nye, and just looking at measurement from a scientific perspective, we use measurement in the physical world to identify the value of things like length, mass, time, and temperature. These measurements help people understand the world around them. Using standard measurements allows everybody in the conversation to understand what's being measured and the context of the results of our measurements. For example, a meter in the United States is going to be the same length if you measure a meter in France, in Nigeria, in Australia, in Johannesburg, in Chile. A pound is a pound, an hour is an hour, a Kelvin is a Kelvin, a degree is a degree. Where we start getting into confusion is when we're using different units of measurement to talk about the same idea. And so if we're talking about Celsius in Europe and we're talking about Fahrenheit in the United States, now we start to have confusion and we need something to transform the data into a consistent format so everybody knows what we're talking about. You know, if I'm in the United States and I never measure temperature in Celsius, and you tell me that it's 15 degrees outside, if I assume 15 degrees in Fahrenheit, that is a very different temperature than 15 degrees in Celsius. You know, if we're talking about how long it takes to go from one place to another, and one person is talking in seconds and another person is talking in hours, or we talk about the distance between here and there, and one person is talking in inches and the other person is talking in centimeters, all kinds of confusion ensues, even though we're talking about the same subject, because we're using different measurements that represent different things to the audience. And so as we go forward and we think about putting metrics in the right context and making sense of everything that we're talking about, we have to make sure that the measurements that we use are speaking the right language, because everything that we're going to do with the metrics is going to influence behavior and drive decisions. You know, even in a general sense, before we start applying it to cybersecurity, my decision about whether or not I'm going to walk or drive a car depends on how far I'm going. You know, if you say, hey, Keon, let's go to the store, and the store is 15 feet away versus 15 miles away, the information about the measurement is going to help me decide. I can walk 15 feet. It would be ridiculous to drive 15 feet. But if I'm going 15 miles, the opportunity cost and the time that I could have spent doing other things instead of walking for 15 miles is going to make a difference. You know, if I'm sitting in a chair, do I sit in a chair that supports 300 pounds? Or do I sit in a chair that supports 50 pounds? I'm not going to sit in my 8-year-old daughter's chair because I just have too much mass for the chair to hold my weight. And so understanding how much weight something can support, or understanding how far we're going to go, or even because a lot of us in cybersecurity leadership have been around for a while and we are chronologically mature, even in that context, my age matters because it relates to the things that I can do. I'm old enough to vote. I'm old enough to drink alcohol if I choose. I'm getting very close to retirement. I'm getting close to being able to draw a pension if I've saved properly. But the measurement of my age, even as simple as that sounds, makes a difference and influences my behavior and my decisions. And so when we apply those worldly physical things, the items that we encounter day by day, week by week, year by year, all of those items also relate in a security context where we need to transform the data and make sure that we are communicating in a format that allows people to make decisions. The struggle with metrics affects all business leaders who are striving to measure and communicate the value of their programs. If it's a security program, it's important to security people. If we're dealing with financial management, there are financial metrics and controls and processes that need to be in place to make sure that the CFO controller and everybody else in financial leadership is meeting their financial performance goals within the organization. And so we're not just talking about something that's unique to security, it's something that is important for the entire organization. The challenge that we have as security leaders is that nobody in the organization understands what the heck we're talking about unless we put it in the right context. And so security metrics might be the most difficult metrics in a business situation to communicate, because most of the people receiving the information and using that information to make decisions are non-technical business leaders who don't speak the security language, and they need transformation of the data and the information so that we can shine a new light on old measurements and help them understand what are we doing. As part of my role, kind of floating around and thinking about everything that I do, one of the great things that has added a lot of value to my work is being a member of the Private Directors Association. Now, a lot of people know the National Association of Corporate Directors, and their mission is to serve the boards of directors for publicly traded companies. Well, the cool thing about the Private Directors Association is that 70% of all economic activity in North America, which includes Mexico and Canada, is driven by privately owned businesses or family-owned companies. And so where NACD is focusing on publicly traded organizations, they're only capturing a fraction of everything that needs to be done. And so in my relationship and in my membership with the Private Directors Organization, I'm exposed to a lot of perspectives and the use of a lot of these things in a real sense. You know, you think about, you go to a family-owned farm and they're doing agribusiness and they have all of these digital controls and robots and GPS systems that are driving the business of the farm. They need to understand security and security metrics as much as a financial services organization or as much as a healthcare organization. And so hanging out with the Private Directors Association also exposes me to very interesting people who spend a lot of time in corporate governance, but don't spend much time in cybersecurity, and there is a great opportunity for sharing. In a presentation last week, Joy Randalls is one of our members of the association, and she said something that was so genius, I had to incorporate it into my presentation. Now, Joy is a business person, not a security person, but she recognized in our security briefing as part of the association that most organizations think reviewing a cyber risk assessment or a compliance audit is all they need to do for their cybersecurity governance. And so you think about the recommendations that come from ISO 31000 or other enterprise risk management frameworks that have a footnote about cybersecurity, but don't focus completely on cybersecurity. Or you think about things where the Federal Trade Commission and regulatory bodies are saying that you have to have somebody on the board of directors who specializes in cybersecurity, and then you pair that wisdom or those regulatory requirements with the idea that most business people think that cyber risk assessment or compliance audits satisfy all your requirements. There is a huge disconnect between what security professionals would say is the right thing to do for cybersecurity and what business people who do not have the same background understand about cybersecurity. Now, the positive aspect and the positive outcome from all of this is that board members and corporate executives understand how to review reports. They understand how to recognize trends. They understand how to evaluate details. What's missing from the equation is the right information in those details so that you can marry both the cybersecurity obligation that board members and corporate directors have with the information that they need to drive good decisions. And so this leads us into the next question. What the heck in the world is a good metric? You know, we have all kinds of confusion when people are using different measurements to describe the same item. We've already talked about that, and we've talked about Celsius and Fahrenheit and inches and centimeters, but then it leads us to have to try to figure out what are the right ways to measure different things. If you go to Gartner, they're not going to have an upper right quadrant for the best metrics that you're going to use in your organization. There is no organization outside of your company that can tell you the best metrics, because the role of a metric is to drive actions and decisions within your organization. And so the best metrics really are going to come from what is the goal of the business? What are we trying to accomplish? What is the level of risk tolerance that we're willing to assume within the organization? How does that relate in terms of key risk indicators and the upper and lower boundaries of how everything operates? And the answer to all of those questions are going to start to identify what data can security gather, align with all of those requirements, and then communicate to the business to say how we're doing. As you go forward and as you spend more time in this, it becomes more and more evident because everybody is coming to the same conclusions because we're using the same measurements. You know, if I go to South Africa with the US dollar, my US dollar is worth, I think at last check, is like 22 South African Rand equals $1 US. And so there is a mismatch. If somebody tells me, hey, it costs 1 Rand and I come with $1 and I give them $1, I've actually given them 22 Rand for something that costs $1. And so it becomes imperative that everybody make sure that they're speaking the right language and that we have the right boundaries. You know, every time I talk to somebody in a different time zone, if I don't say the time zone that I'm in and I'm trying to schedule a meeting with somebody in Pacific time, if I say that we're meeting at 9 o'clock and they agree, and then I send the calendar invitation and it pops up on their calendar at 6 a.m., they're going to object because not everybody wants to get up at 6 a.m. And so the good metrics being the key to unlocking communication also requires that everybody is on the same page about our measurements, about our boundaries, about their value, and about the context that those measurements have for the specific organization, not for the industry or not for every company around the world, because every company is going to be unique. Every company is different. Every company has different drivers, and the metrics that you gather are going to tell different stories based on different contexts that you're encountering. And so when we get into solutions, again, using the academic approach by listing things according to the numbers, the solution to the problem of metrics and communicating value and making sure that our metrics make sense is to use the right framework, to present the right information, and to present your findings in a business context. When we talk about frameworks, there are lots of frameworks that you can use. My favorite framework is going to be NIST Special Publication 800-55. Now, there is an ISO counterpart for all of our international friends, but because the National Institute of Standards and Technology is putting our tax dollars to use, NIST 800-55 has been a great tool that has lasted for a long time and has stood the test of multiple revisions of the approach that NIST uses for FISMA, for FedRAMP, for cyber maturity model certification, and for everything else. The objective of the document is to provide guidance on how an organization, through the use of metrics, can identify the adequacy of in-place controls, policies, and procedures. If you read through the entire document, what you'll discover is that there is a very clear and well-designed approach to help management decide where to invest in additional security protections, in additional people, in additional resources, or in additional technical controls. And it provides a process for categorizing all of your metrics so that they make sense when you present them to the decision makers and to the stakeholders that need to do something with the information. When we talk about the adequacy of in-place security controls, policies, and procedures, this really is the highlight of the document. If you read nothing else, or if you take nothing else from my conversation, this is really what we're talking about when we talk about avoiding senseless security metrics. If I can describe a situation and the impact and the consequences of our actions, and I can use fact-based evidence to drive the decisions, then I'm on the right track to get my business counterparts to respond properly to the information that I'm providing. Again, it's all about the framework, and the beauty of 800-55 as a framework is that you can tailor and customize all of the data that you're gathering to tell the story that reflects the situation on the ground for your organization. It is a great tool to move you from theoretical approaches to actual approaches that are going to resonate with the business and that are going to drive some kind of meaningful decision or result within the organization. Now, the thing about the NIST 855 that I like, that I've used when I was a federal employee at the CDC, and that I have continued to use just as an advisor and a consultant, is the categorizations that they provide within the framework. You know, the benefit of the way that they've laid things out is that the implementation measures, the effectiveness and the efficiency measures, and the impact measures allow you to start to slice and dice all of the information that you have within your organization and put it in a context that makes sense. When we talk about implementation measures relate to the execution of your security policy. And so if you're using NIST for whatever reason, and you've looked at the 800-53 or the 800-171, or even an ISO where your information security management system is built upon policy, I can now start to think about what is everything that we can gather numerically that is going to describe how well we are executing all of our policy requirements. Within the 800-55, they give some qualities of good metrics. And so if my metrics are quantifiable, readily attainable, it's a repeatable process that I use to gather them, and the metrics are going to track performance and direct resources. Now I'm telling a very good story about the implementation and the execution of my security policy. The same idea is going to apply to my efficiency and effectiveness measures. What is the results of delivering security services? Are we doing trusted platform modules? Are we doing encryption? Are we doing authentication and authorization? Do we have radius set up? Are we doing 802.1x? All of these are going to be things that we're delivering as security services. And if you're really advanced and mature, you're aligning your delivery of security services with ITIL for IT service management. But all of this is going to produce a lot of data that you can gather and use to communicate to the business. How well are we delivering the services that are going to reduce risk to an acceptable level and maintain that level of performance over a period of time? The last category focuses on impact measures, which often is going to describe the business or mission consequences of a security event. Did we have a data breach? Did we have unauthorized access or disclosure of personally identifiable information? Has a HIPAA violation happened where we failed to satisfy the requirements of the security rule or the privacy rule? All of these security incident and incident response activities that are happening within the organization are addressed by the impact measures that are listed in the 800-55. Now, when we go to develop our reports and start talking about things, instead of just having a risk register or a blob of information that has no format, that has no context, or doesn't make sense to people who don't deal with this every day, we have the beginnings of an approach that's going to start to describe things based on categories. And now in my executive briefings, or in my meetings with board members, or in my meetings with business counterparts, they can now use the data that I'm providing to make decisions. Do we need to improve the conformance with our security policies? Do we need to take an action to improve the way that we're delivering security services to prevent breaches, outages, and negative consequences? Is there something that we need to do to reduce the frequency of security incidents or the consequences of an incident occurring? All of this, as answers to the questions, lead to something like visual acuity, where by scientific definition, visual acuity just focuses on the clarity of vision measured by your ability to recognize small details with precision. What we're talking about in this conversation is increasing the ability that you have to communicate small details that matter to the business so that they can make the right decisions. You know, we talked about a nude prescription was the subtitle, so it makes sense to look at the eye chart, and even looking at the eye chart, you know, via the presentation over the web when I'm doing screen sharing, there comes a point where the E is much easier to read than the letters that get on the 11 line or the 10 line or the 9 line. Anything below that red line that stands out, you're getting into some extreme clarity of vision measured by your visual acuity. Our goal as security leaders is to make sure that the acuity of the representation of all of the data that we have about cybersecurity is appropriate and precise enough that the business can make the right decisions so that they can apply limited resources to the right problems that the organization is facing. You know, one of the benefits of metrics is that we can assign resources to the right problems because the resources that we have are limited. There's only so much money, there's only so many people, there's only so much process and technology. So the priority of all of our efforts have to focus on the things that have the greatest impact. Understanding the greatest impact is in relation to the clarity of vision that we have about everything that we're facing. When you're doing metrics properly, it allows you to give fact-based information about the situation. You know, there is a statistic that people often quote about the cost of a data breach, where depending on what industry you're talking about and depending on what region of the world you're applying it to, people say that the cost of a data breach is somewhere between $100 per record up to $350 per record, again, depending on the regulatory impacts and other things. If I were gathering good metrics, everybody has incidents, everybody has breaches. In an ideal sense, you want to do containment, eradication, and recovery so that the impact is minimized. But what would be the value of having very good metrics that measure the impact of a data breach, that identifies the actual cost that your organization realized, that identified where the control failures were in our service delivery that allowed the breach? Now we have much better fact-based information related to the situation on the ground in our organization, which is going to drive us to make the right decisions. You know, what is the consequence of a security incident? What is that security incident doing to us? How much money are we spending responding? And is that cost of response greater than or less than the preventive measures that we could have put in place to prevent the incident from happening? You know, you imagine when you're doing your capital budgeting and you're planning for what you're going to spend in the next fiscal year or over a period of time, and you come to the table and say, you know, when I add up the hours that people are spending and the reputational impact and the operational impact related to our revenue, we are actually spending $5 million a year responding to incidents, but the cost of controls that I want to put in place is $2 million. Do we really want to spend $5 million year over year, or would it make more sense to the organization to spend $2 million now? We depreciate it over 3 years, we average it out, and then we buy something new 3 years from now. That is a much different conversation, and we're going to be able to drive results, decisions, and actions because we have data that reinforces the situation, the argument that we're making, and the story that we're telling. And so when you're having your metrics aligned to the categories that I talked about related to the NIST 800-55. The other fact-based information that you want to include in the conversation is the relationship to those metrics on your financial impacts, your operational impacts, your regulatory impacts, and then some people like reputation, other people don't like reputation. It depends on your industry and the number of competitors that you have in that environment. You know, for example, I'm not picking on Equifax, but I live in Atlanta. They happen to be one of our hometown companies that employ a lot of people. When you look at the data, you know, quarter after quarter after quarter after the data breach occurred, there was not a significant impact on their stock price because they took specific measurable actions responding to the breach, but the switching costs of going to Equifax to TransUnion or going from Equifax to one of the other credit reporting agencies are extremely high. Yes, consumers might make different decisions, but most consumers don't pay attention to all the services, and significant revenue comes from business to business relationships. And so Equifax doesn't go out of business after a massive data breach. In part, it was their response, but the other factor that measures into this and that you can look at from a metrics perspective is that there aren't a lot of options that people can switch to. We'd be better off staying with who we're with because we've invested heavily, and we don't want to have a lot of technical debt or costs that we can't recover because we choose to work with somebody else who might be susceptible to the same attacks. And so the fact-based information is going to drive your decisions. The other thing that you have to think about is, how am I going to present all this information? When I was at the CDC, you know, you have 85,000 people distributed across more than 50 country offices and centers, institutes, and offices that are global. That is a ton of information. You know, credit to the CDC and the statistical analysis that they do and the way that they represent data. It gave me great opportunities to understand how to take a huge data set, compile it down, and then present it to people to make decisions. What normally happens, you know, going again into the Wayback Machine, I see a lot of people that represent their cybersecurity data and their metrics in pie charts. But the problem with the pie chart is that it represents a point in time. It could be quarter over quarter where we say, hey, this quarter, this was the frequency. The next quarter, this was the frequency. And you could try to use a point in time assessment to represent all the data. The other opportunity is to use a line graph that says, or that does a better job of representing the data over time. But once the number of items that you're measuring pass a certain threshold, you can imagine that this line chart would be very complicated and very difficult to read if I had 50 metrics that I was measuring rather than just 3 metrics. And so one of the things that's going to help you show changes over time, drive people to understand the data, to represent the data in a context that captures everything that matters, is really to start getting into the process of using a histogram. You know, Amber and I had a great conversation when we were promoting the session, and we kind of geeked out about statistical analysis and standard deviation and all kinds of mathematical functions. But the cool thing about a histogram is that large volumes of data can be represented in a small chart. By academic definition, your histogram is just a graphic representation that organizes a group of data points into specified ranges. And so I could have a range if we were doing it as low, moderate, high, or red, yellow, green. Everything that's low is going to fall into one bar. Everything that's moderate is going to fall into another bar. Everything that's high falls into another bar. Or I could have ranges specified based on the categories that we were talking about for the 800-55. The value of this is that it's similar in appearance to a bar graph, so everybody is going to be able to read it, but the histogram is going to condense a large volume of data into an easily interpreted visual by taking all the data points and grouping them into logical ranges. This is not something that people normally learn in school. It's not something that you see in a lot of cybersecurity education. Most of your security education is programming and computer science and data, but there has to be an opportunity to take all the data that you've gathered and present it to your business people. Now, academically, histograms are commonly used in statistics, and again, the CDC does a lot of statistical analysis. This is where I was introduced to the process. The benefit of the histogram is that now you can start to apply other factors into your analysis so that you tell the story from even more context to drive even better decisions. You know, you have things like a moving average convergence divergence line that helps you identify the trend following momentum indicators that show the relationship between two moving averages. Imagine if I developed the capability to identify the moving average for my mean time to detect and the moving average for my mean time to remediate. And then I represented on the histogram all of the incidents that come into the organization in relation to the moving average of my detection and my remediation capabilities. What that's going to do is over time, it's going to tell the story that we are adequate, that we are horrible, or that we are awesome related to our ability to respond to incidents that are identified within the organization. Other things like frequency distribution are going to help you represent the number of observations within a given interval, either in a graphical or tabular format, that kind of leads us into what does the shape of the picture look like and how does that matter? If I go to a board meeting, the board of directors, having been on a board, being the chair of a risk committee on a board right now, there is a little bit of time to talk about a lot of things. And so if I go to the board and say, dear board, this is the graphic representation of all of my security data. And maybe I have one distribution for my efficiency metrics. I have one distribution for my incident metrics. I have another distribution for my policy metrics. I can go to the board and have a detailed 15-minute conversation that drives meaningful decisions based simply on the shape of the picture. If it's a normal distribution, the outcomes are likely to occur on either side of the average. If it's a, excuse me, if it's a bimodal distribution, I have two peaks and it describes the data where we have a combination of normal distributions. If it's skewed to the right or if it's skewed to the left, it tells me where things are organized and consolidated, which is going to help us to drive a decision because things are either getting better or getting worse. If it's a random distribution, the data is all over the place and we might need to take some kind of action to stabilize things and to balance everything out so that we can measure the data and understand what's happening. All of this kind of goes back into the conversation about standard deviation. If I measure the variance or the dispersion of values using standard deviation, I can start to indicate if everything is close to the mean, it's under control. If it falls one or two deviations outside the mean, we have an uncontrolled situation. And I can use analysis of the volatility of my standard deviation to start to explore and understand how bad is the situation. If something happens, 2 or 3 standard deviations from the mean, that is a very unlikely situation. It should draw my attention. It is something abnormal that stands out that is going to drive us to jump into action. And we're jumping into action because we've gathered good data and we can readily, quickly, and easily identify outliers. Now, some of your security tools are going to do this for you. The benefit of my discussion is that even if I don't have a budget, if I work in a hospital, most of our patients are indigent care. I'm depending on Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements, and we have no budget to buy next generation security tools that are going to do this for me. I can take all of the data that I have, plot it on a diagram, measure it properly, and see what are my outliers based on using open source tools and the data that it spits out. And so your ability to start using math and statistical analysis and everything else is going to add a lot of value. And then you start adding your upper and lower boundaries for the key risk indicators. We could say that our KRI for one data point, if it falls outside one standard deviation from the mean, that is a situation that requires some remedial action, a conversation with the board, or something else. Now we're combining our statistical analysis with our risk indicators to drive action to make sure that everybody is on the same page, is doing the same things, and is focusing on the right problems. With all of that said, what it really boils down to is that your standard deviation and all these measurements and the frameworks that we're using give you an ability to measure volatility, to drive decisions, and take actions. If I put everything in the right format, it's going to help the business make the right decisions with the right information using the limited resources that we have available so that everybody's on the right track. I look forward to the day where every CISO can write a letter to the board that says, "Dear board, the data that I'm presenting represents the consequences of all of our decisions, and this is what we need to do next based on very good data that tells a story that represents the situation on the ground in our organization based on all the data that we've gathered. We know how well our policies are working. We know how well we are delivering security services. We understand the impact of the incidents that we face, and all of this information is produced by gathering the right metrics, putting them in the right format, categorizing them properly, and then using math, statistical analysis, and other good frameworks to communicate the situation in the right context. My executive summary for all of this: standards lead everybody to speak the same language. You have to make sure that everybody's on the same page. The right metrics in the context of the business are going to tell the right story that allows everybody to focus on problems that drive action and decisions. And if we present everything in the context of the business, the world will be a better place. Now, as we go forward, I'm almost out of time. I will go through the questions and answer as many as I can. In closing, before we jump into the questions, I'm honored that EC Council allowed me to present again. This has been a fabulous relationship. I hope you got something positive out of me geeking out related to numbers and statistical analysis and metrics. If you'd like to connect on LinkedIn or shoot me an email, because we're limited in time, I'm happy to keep the conversation going. And with that, I say thank you very much, and I'll answer some of the questions. Okay, so we have one question that was talking about all businesses are different, but there's a common thread in many organizations. What are some of the specific metrics you use for patch management or vulnerability management? For this one, I think the cool thing about this question is that even though organizations are different, we have tools that are similar. So if you look at something like NIST Special Publication 800-40, it is the guideline for enterprise patch management. In that document, it talks about the solution, the policy, the procedures, the standards, and the technology management for doing everything. If we're applying metrics to that approach, two of the things that I would measure are, number one, what is the time frame that it takes for me to apply patches? And number two, what is the impact of our patch management program relative to vulnerabilities, events, and incidents that we encounter in the environment? For example, I think the Australian Signals Directorate and other people have done a lot of research that said if you just patch your systems in a timely manner, it reduces the ability of 85% of targeted attacks to have an impact on your organization. And so if we say 85% is the benchmark, we're going to patch as quickly as reasonably possible for our organization. Now our attack surface has been reduced from 100% to 15%, and now I can measure, is that really the situation? If I patch everything, does that have an impact on the number of incidents that we're seeing within the environment? Or if I patch everything, does that impact the scope of the incidents when they do occur in the environment? Security tools so another question that came in was talking about, could you name some security tools that do actual statistical analysis with bell curves? The reason that I selected standard deviation as one of the tools that I wanted to talk about is that you actually can use Excel to generate your standard deviation, and you can draw the bell curve based on the height of the curve in the model when you do it. The benefit of using standard deviation with Excel is that a lot of the items that you're going to output from your security tools can be extracted as comma separated values. Then you can ingest all that data into Excel. And then from Excel, you can model it properly so that you can identify this is how the information looks when I plot it in a histogram, which you can also do in Excel, or when I plot it on a standard deviation chart. The next question was focusing on, in my experience, what has been the single metric that has most driven change in the organization? At the CDC, the metric that mattered the most was compliance, because we were fanatics about FSMA, and there was a competition between the CDC and all the other operating divisions for health and human services. And so when we talk about the compliance with the policy, most of our metrics there were focused on policy, because all of your technical security controls, there really is no budget. Everything is done through appropriations. And so as a security leader in a federal agency, I had very little control over money. I had the most control over policy, governance, and compliance. And so that's where we focused. What I've seen for other organizations is that the industry is going to drive the metrics that matter the most. Financial services, I think, have some of the best metrics, but they would be overbearing for something like a shipping and logistics company, or even for retail companies. And so like a lawyer, I'm not trying to defer the question, but it really does depend. If you want to pick up the conversation, again, I see I'm kind of running out of time. I'd we can explore it more deeply, but it's going to depend on what's driving your business. If I'm in financial services, we can't exchange money if we don't satisfy our regulatory requirements. You know, if I'm an electrical utility, NERC is going to drastically influence whether or not we're going to be able to continue to operate and whether or not we're going to be fined. And so I would say for everybody, you can start with regulatory or contract requirements. Just don't stop there, because compliance is not solving your security problem. It's just giving you the kickstart that you need to get everybody in the business on board with the program. And so with that, my last slide, and this is for the recording as much as it is for the live people. If you enjoyed the conversation, I'm doing a conference again tomorrow, or not tomorrow, I'm doing a conference again next week on the 13th and 14th. This is not a sales pitch, but an invitation. Some of the speakers that are at the conference now have been speakers at our conference as well. We intentionally have our conference after the Global CISO Forum so that we're not overshadowing the event. I continue to love the Global CISO Forum, which is also the reason that your discount code for complimentary access to the event is Global CISO Forum. I hope that you enjoy the rest of this conference. I hope that you choose to join us at our conference next week. And I hope that if you're a CISO holder, you continue, a certified CISO credential holder, that you continue to engage in the community, contribute to the CISO magazine, and continue to partner with all of us who are part of the certified CISO family. Thank you very much.